also in the next 5 years, and also for this amount of money, which is the only amount of money we're gonna pay you. At that point, if they're promising you magic, or if someone's promising you magic, say no. But also when people are asking us for magic, that's also the time to walk away, because they're actually not serious. This is not a serious consideration.
Well, first of all, I'm not a consultant, so I realize I should have made that confession right from the beginning. But we are developing, at the Building Movement Project, a race equity assessment. So I feel like I should just say what we're doing and why. And it really started when after the results of the survey came out, people started saying, well, are you going to develop an assessment from the survey? And we said no. And then we were doing focus groups. I was doing the white focus groups, and I was doing focus groups with white CEOs. And after a couple of the focus groups, I went back to Sean and I said, we have a problem. Because the white CEOs are all saying, yes, we definitely want to do race equity work. We just need a lot of money for it. And I said, okay, so all these white dominant organizations are going to go to funders and take all the money away, again, from people of color-led organizations. So as we discussed this, we realized that we should develop a free, low barrier to entry race equity assessment so that nobody can say we can't start our race equity journey. And that assessment should help them hire a consultant to do that work. And there are 4 areas that we're in the process. It is really an amazing process to be going through, as Andrew knows. But there are 4 areas that we've identified. So we have a group of advisors that are all race equity consultants, and there are 4 areas we've identified that really echo what people in the panel have said. One is, what's your organization's kind of responsiveness? How open are you to change? This is what we're measuring. The assessment will go to staff and board of the organization. And actually, eventually, there'll be an algorithm that gives them a result that will give them a narrative, like a story, like kind of a strength finder. The second thing is, what sort of relationships or conversations do you already have in your organization? Can you have difficult conversations? If you've never had a hard conversation in your organization, you don't dive off the deep end because you don't even know how, you don't have that muscle of how to have a hard conversation. The third area is the leadership committed, because you know that committee over here that's asking for it, of middle level staff, and the leadership is like, you go ahead and do that. I'm never really going to do anything to change. And the fourth area is, do people have voice and power in the organization, especially people of color? So that's kind of the 4 capacities, or I don't even know how to say it. It's almost like a diagnostic so that people would get a sense of where they are in that, and then that might help them hire a race equity consultant.
So I heard a lot there. I think one thing that is coming up for me, and what we hear a lot when we go into organizations is, and we heard it on the last panel, the kind of window dressing, right? So there's maybe the chief diversity officer is calling you, and maybe that's usually a black woman or a person of color specifically. And they're really trying to lead the work because they were hired to do something that the organization doesn't actually want to do. How do you as a consultant manage that? And the question that we usually get is, I'm a person of color stuck with this work, no one wants to do it, and I can't leave. Is there a responsibility for, and this is something I've been thinking about, this is not a question they've gotten, but is there a responsibility as consultants to support them in work that they're struggling to do internally? Where is that line? And how can you, and how do you do it if that's something that you feel responsible for? That's something I'm struggling with. And so I don't know the answers to that, but I'm hoping you have some thoughts. And I think generally, I think just the overall question of how do you work within organizations where there's a group of folks that want to do the work, but the overall organization does not yet know what that work actually requires.
Yeah. hear the word responsibility, there's some sort of an aversion to that I feel. And I think in particular because I'm thinking about your question and I'm, hearing is there a responsibility to sort of support that chief diversity officer who's been hired to dance on a stage. And then I have to ask myself, well, is there a responsibility for us to get free? Is there a responsibility for us to be liberated? And I think the answer is not so much a responsibility, but definitely a desire, a right. So in terms of those kinds of relationships, I think it depends on a number of things. I think, number one, it depends on the fact that just because someone is in that position as a person of color to sort of, do diversity work, diversity, equity, inclusion work within the organization doesn't mean that that's what they're there to do, which I know is the point you already made, Jessica. And then I think in addition to that, it's, how much of a commitment are they willing to make in scamming white supremacy? Yes. Because if I know that I've been hired within a predominantly white organization to do diversity work, and I know that organization doesn't want to do that work, then it becomes a scam for me where I still have to finagle and use whatever power that I've been allotted within the organization to still see that diversity work be done. Now, the extent of me being able to do that is going to really be dependent on the organization and leadership. But I think in addition to that, I can do as much as I can so I can recognize whatever that boundary is for me. I'm willing to go all in for 40 hours a week to ensure that staff members of color, and in addition to that, white staff members who are actually committed to anti-racism work are in rooms talking about race. Or I'm going to commit to 40 hours a week to ensuring that folks who are working in HR, who I know have major issues with being extremely, extremely biased to hiring people of color in leadership, that they actually are in rooms talking about race, that they actually are being held to, very regular sort of like assessments, that give them a very firm understanding of the ways in which their biases are impacting the organization. But I think for me it comes down to what is the expectation, what are my intended goals? Because I would never recommend either the consultant or the person in that position of leadership sort of not going into that situation without a boundary or without a very clear sort of delineation between what they feel is the work that they would like really to do and also what the work that they actually are capable of doing within the context of that situation. So for me, it's what are the expectations, what are the outcomes, what are these sort of intended outcomes, and what actually is our capacity?
Yeah, I think about, if we get into an organization and they're talking about hiring equity person, normally we would be like, whoa, like, hold your horses. Because where are they sitting? If you're hiring those people to be in HR and they don't have a strategy, they don't have a strategy role, they're not sitting at the leadership table, they're not sitting at the table that is determining goals and objectives for the whole organization, is a trap. And so, because we've now made it about personnel, and we've made it about stuff that's not about it's not about what power is. We've made them chief diversity officers, but not equity and inclusion officers. And we give them the title, but don't actually allow them to do the work. So then, what's our job as consultants that step into that system? I think that I want to echo, not every person of color, by virtue of being people of color, are committed to dismantling white supremacy. And so, my first role is to determine who I'm working with. Right? Like, am I working with a diversity officer that got hired because he is there to not let it be about white supremacy, but about hiring folk? Yeah. And if that's who's there, then my job is to organize to get them out. And to help have people get over their protectiveness of ineffective leadership of color. Especially if it's leadership of color that is unwilling to recognize what they're doing. Some folk suddenly awaken and are like, whoa, this is a trap, I need to shift my accountability. But if that accountability is not unshiftable, if they're unwilling to shift that, then we have to be ready, I think, to offer support and guidance to say, you have to find ways to limit the power this person has. Because they become the reason why the work doesn't move. And it's damaging to the organization and to the people of color in the organization. I think that my work, and I think the way we Crossroads we are work, if that person of color that is in that position, for whatever reason, they chose it, they didn't know that's what it was going to be like, but now they're there and they feel responsible, name the scenario, they're in it, then our job is to help strategize them and other people together. That the first job is to not have them be the sole person responsible. It's too vulnerable a place to be if they're gonna become change agents. So they need to figure out a way to get them a committee, a task force, a group of people that has some recognition in the system that they collectively hold the work. So that then it's not just that person. Then the other thing is to help the system begin to explore their own superficiality, particularly when it comes to following the leadership of people of color. And let's be clear, those diversity officers, 75% of the time, are women of color. And no system is set up to follow, the leadership of people of color, and much less the leadership of women of color. Right? Our experience at Crossroads is when we got 3 women of color to run our organization, suddenly nobody knew how to follow leadership. Right? Suddenly everything was up for question. Right? So not when the white guys were there. That was totally okay when the white guys were there. Put 3 women in charge, and suddenly it's like, well, I don't know how to do this anymore. So our job is to help build capacity somewhere else in the system so that they have time to organize themselves and find their bearings. In other words, we can run interference in coordinated and strategic ways to provide them the space to coordinate themselves, to gather people, to find not their white allies, because I don't like that word, to find the people with whom they can build a conspiracy for liberation and a conspiracy to change the system. And you're going to need some white folks, and those people are going to need some room to find who those white folks are. And to make sure that those white folks are ready to step in and to have skin in the game, just like this equity person has skin in the game. So for me, yes, we have some role to play, but I agree with you. Is it responsibility? I don't know. I think for me, cosmically, in the sense that I want all people of color to succeed, sure, I have responsibility. But the question is, strategically, if I'm in a long-term relationship, then how am I going to play a role that sustains the long-term relationship, moves the work forward, and holds this person, even if they choose to leave, that at least the narrative they take with them is not a narrative that they failed, it's a narrative that the institution failed them. Even if that's all we do.
And I'll just add briefly because the reason I feel responsibility because, quite frankly, Angel, I was that person. Right? So I moved from essentially what I call an internal consultant to now an independent consultant, having worked in several positions that reflected different parts of that story. I have an empathy for people who engage, people of color in particular who engage in that equity liberation work. And I'm deeply aware of the emotional, psychic, and physiological cost that can come along with doing it. So I'm mentor into mastermind with people who are doing this work because I know it takes a lot with very little sort of reward or return on investment of the energy that goes into being that person in the organization. So yes, I feel a connection to that, and I would say I am deeply invested in professionalizing this work in a way that says, because you are a person of color or have an emerging identity, you're best suited to do this work. I don't think it is an asset, and in professionalizing the work, I'd like to think of a number of skills, knowledge, and aptitudes I've developed over the course of 45 years in order to be in the position that I am now. So I put and invest that way of thinking for all people who step into that work. CDO, any of those roles, what skills, knowledge, background do you bring to this work? How have you sharpened yourself into an instrument of change? And so a lot of my work in longer projects is helping the person in that position become who they need to be in order to drive the work. What do they need to know, not just about the work, it really is about self. How do I show up? And that you are the most important instrument, because that is about how do you create your support network, but also so your army, to take on the work within the organization and externally. And that is really about who you are and how you show up. So that is an important part of that process for me, engaging with that individual on the level of, what do you need? How can I support you? But on a greater level around, how do you build that skill? And do I think what was mentioning, maybe it's not the right place for you. The change you seek is not possible here. How do we leverage your skills and assets? If this is work you really want to be doing, how do I get you to a place where you can do it somewhere else? Because I've been in the position of sort of beating my head against it, hoping that it would change, primarily because of the commitment, the mission, and the reflection of the community. Populations that we're working with look like me. It wasn't about them, it was about them. So I was like, I know if I can just turn the tide, I don't want to let them hurt people. So we have to take care of ourselves and find ways to do the work in ways that are beneficial to us, but also to the mission, our personal mission, for the people that we know.
So what that brings up for me is time, right? So the sense of urgency in white supremacy culture is numbing, and it's something that, especially with the kind of, I think Angelique said, it's the term du jour, this racial equity thing, in the sense, and folks are now getting money to do this work, and so they just put some stuff on a piece of paper and call that the strategy. And then the sense of urgency to get to those metrics doesn't allow for what you're talking about, and it doesn't allow for that personal transformation, and it doesn't allow for the organization and the individuals in it to really shift to other ways of knowing, which is really what we're talking about in a lot of ways. And so, have you had experience with that sense of urgency, and how do you slow the pace down to actually do the work that's required, and actually be realistic about the goals that we're setting within organizations at the proper kind of pace and time frame? We'll start over here. We haven't started over here.
Okay, I'm not a consultant, but I'll just say. I present.
Amen, friends.
Well, I've done presentations for the last 2 years all around the country, and I just want to say a couple of things that really relate to this. And Andrew, and you and I have talked some about this. First of all, people are getting really skilled at the rocking chair. I love that. That people are acquiring language so that they don't have to change. And I see it everywhere we go. And I feel like in every presentation now I have to say change is actually change. It's not talking about change. I think we've conflated the two, especially white leadership. And I think a sense of urgency really reinforces that.
Yep.
Because change takes time, and if it's a sense of urgency, you don't have to change, just something has to change in the organization. And I think, in our advisory committee, one of the leader of Race Forward, Glenn Harris, said this thing that, he said, when you do race equity work, he said, everybody has anxiety. He said, people of color have anxiety because they think, oh, it's all going to fall on us now. Here comes the boom. And white people have anxiety because they're like, okay, now I'm going to be called a racist. And as we thought about that, the sense of having to hold that anxiety that people are coming in with, and what it means to make a transformation. And I think people want to skip the anxiety step. They want to feel safe and good, but we can't we all know we can't make change in safety. So just some observations from presenting across the country.
Other responses to that in terms of the kind of sense of urgency, time, what it actually takes to do transformational work?
Yeah, so I keep thinking about how do we manage this in my office badly. But when I think about the formula, if there is a formula to what we do, I think it revolves around three things. One is showing up more than just at the points of a deliverable. right? It's showing up not just at the training. It's thinking that I'm invested in a long-term relationship. And so that if I can show up on the phone, on Zoom, if I can show up at some random conversation, that what I have in those places where folks are not consumed by what the evaluation is going to say, but are now really thinking and processing learnings and insights, which could take 3 months, it could take 6 months. Then I have an opportunity to say, and this is why I can redirect you. But if I'm not showing up, if I'm not seeing my relationship to you as an important component of our work, then I can't organize you. And if I can't organize you, I can't get you to slow down. And so at Crossroads, we really think of ourselves as organizers of change, not just as consultants, that our job is to organize an institution to change. If that takes us 30 years, then we'll just show up for 30 years. But what showing up also allows you to do is that it allows you to tell people the truth. And I will tell you the truth, and I'll tell you I love you. And I tell you, and you suck at this, right? Like, I super love you, but you're being super sucky right now. And I want to remind you, and I read that part of love today in the conversation in the other panel. I struggle with love because I don't hate the heart. The heart's a good thing. But we're superficial with love. I think love doesn't exist in the heart. Love exists in the gut. It exists in the viscera. And when you're moved by your viscera, when you have a visceral reaction to something, then it isn't shallow love. It's a kind of deep thing. Like, I didn't even promise my spouse forever, because I don't know that I love her forever. I can love her in 5-year increments, right? And we can check in, and then we can decide if we love each other, right? Like, shit, I mean, who loves forever? Like, I don't have that kind of love. But I have sustaining power. I'll show up. I'm loyal as hell, and I'll be there. And so, like, how does one show up so that our relationships mature, so that we can tell each other the truth? And it may be that we don't start slow, but that we are strategic in our relationship, then we can slow down. And that may require a couple failures, because sometimes what's required for slowing down, unfortunately, it's hitting yourself against the wall a couple times, right? And I think that the other piece that I would say around this is that you have to do follow-up. And that follow-up can't just be about selling people stuff or about asking for things, right? I'm like you. I talk to 1,000 people all the time about stuff that's not in any way related to the thing that we may have a contract around. Because if they know that I'm a resource, I talk to people who didn't give us a contract. Like, who were like, yeah, you're not the contractor for me, but can I call you sometime? Sure, call me. Because people need resourcing. And so to me, part of the slowing down, part of meeting the urgency is, how do I meet the multiple levels of urgency that are operating? The personal urgency of, I don't want to fail. The institutional urgency of, I want to look good. And the urgency of the people who are actually dying, who are not even in the room where we're talking, right? And so how do I keep that urgency present, meet the individual urgency, and help the institution understand that that superficial movement doesn't actually stop what's happening outside. It just can exacerbate it. So to me, that's, if we have a formula, it's that.
And I'll just add that there are 3 things that pop out to me connected to this in terms of things that get in the way of that transformational change process. Misdiagnosing the problem, which is why diagnosis is
Yep.
prescription without diagnosis is malpractice.
Yep.
How I would train. So thinking about how do we get really clear about that. That obviously leads to, in many cases, the wrong solution or solutions, interventions, whatever you call it. And then the third, which is connected to this question, is misjudging the timeline,
Yes.
which connects to the sense of urgency. It's like, can we change in 3 months?
Nope.
Can we? No. The research we said on change management, the timeline with committed and intentional focus and effort is 7 to 9 years. Again, the timeline with committed and intentional focus on this is 7 to 9 years. That meaning for breakthrough change,
Yeah.
meaning and sustainable, meaning that when the consultants leave, when that charismatic leader, someone when they move out, everything doesn't fall apart. I'm saying that it's in the DNA, and you're trying to bake it in. The work is about how do we bake it into the cake, all right? I'm sure you all have had beautiful buttercream icing and just some dry ass. You're just so disappointed.
You're like,
Oh, and a lot of the work that we're doing is beautiful buttercream icing. Beautiful, just, it's so delicious. I can't wait to get it. And you get it and you're like, I paid $5 for this cupcake for this. And so how do we bake it in? It takes time. And so we have to acknowledge and appreciate how change works. And I think Mackenzie said it earlier on our call, what's important is leadership in particular, the willingness to be changed.
Yeah.
As a critical foundation for all of them. Are the people in the organization, particularly positional leaders, willing to be changed? And model that transformation for others who say, well, okay, all right, I follow your lead.
Yeah.
And that's critically important in terms of that time.
So this just leads to so many more questions that I have, but I want to leave time for folks in the audience to ask questions of these four. So I'm gonna bring the mic around to folks, and if there are questions, please feel free to ask and use the brilliance in the room. I'll come to you all.
So my question is, when you encounter an organization that reaches out for your support and you have found they're not ready and they don't have the right frame, do you ever have organizations come back later and they are ready? And if so, what has changed and what are kind of the mechanisms at play you think that lead an organization to readiness?
So again, I can think of one example in our history, that a very particular example is a community of women religious. We do a lot of work with the religious community. A community of women religious that came to us and said, "Hey, can you help us not die? Can you help us recruit brown folks so that we don't die?" And we were like, "No, we don't do that." And then they came back and they said, "Okay, so we don't want to do it for that reason. We want to do it because we really do value diversity, something about the Bible, blah, blah, blah." So we said, "Okay, so who are the people of color to whom you're accountable? Like, you're all white, so who are your conversation partners?" And they're like, "Well, we don't have any. Do we need to have those people?" And we were like, "Yes, you need to have those people. Go get some. Like, and don't be superficial about it. Like, tell them the truth. Like, tell them the truth of why you're wanting to be in a relationship with them." And it took them like a year. And they came back and they said, "Okay, we've worked really hard this year to have honest conversation, and there are 10 folks that have agreed with a number of conditions, including they are not to be photographed, they are not to be used in promotional material. Like, they've agreed to journey with us, and we've agreed to their terms." At which point we said, "Okay, let's have a conversation, and we want to meet these people." Because I don't want some magical people that you made up, right? And what's happened is, so they've been at it for about 7-8 years. Those people are still there. Those people are still journeying with them. Those people have brought other people. And more importantly, the resources that this community of women religious has invested has allowed and has been transformative for those leaders of color to take their work somewhere else. Now, have they really changed that much? No. I think that they've moved one dial up on the needle, because it's really hard if your entire life commitment is what we are actually taking apart. We're dismantling your entire life. But what they've been able to do is to actually become a catalyzer for other people's work. And so for us, our yes, in many ways, was driven by the fact that there was something really interesting about these community leaders saying yes to these women. that something about that yes is what made us say yes. And that we are clear that our accountability, while we had some accountability to the sisters, that we fundamentally had accountability to support the yes of these people who had made a decision to journey with this community. It's not a decision we regret. I mean, the amount of work that those yeses have generated outside of that community is remarkable. But I think that for us, it was about listening to the people of color who were saying, yes, we used that, they were our barometer. Are the people of color that are showing up in this conversation actually the people of color? Are these people really understanding the depth of the work, even if the white folks are still not there? That was why we said yes the second time.
All right, that's me. Hi. First off, thank you so much for allowing us to pick your brain and for your brilliance in this room. I really appreciate it. My question is, ooh, everybody's looking at me. My question is, often as change makers or change managers, we're asked to kind of rock the boat and move things forward, move things along. What are some tools or some gut feelings that you use to understand when an organization is ready, how quickly they can change, how gradual that change needs to be? When do you know if you need to challenge them or if you need to coddle them a little bit? How do you make that assessment or make that judgment as to how much you need to rock that boat and make sure nobody falls off?
For me, I think it would sort of start with who my main contact is within the organization. And I want to respond first to your question about, how much to rock the boat. So when I think about nonprofit organizations in particular, I know that I have to come into that space being trauma informed because they are filled with trauma, and a lot of traumatized people who are coming into the space because they want to be saviors, because they know potentially in the past have either experienced some sort of an event where they felt like everything was out of control, they didn't have support. They come into an organization, they want to be helpful and they want to, be change makers. So if I'm working with a main contact who holds several marginalized identities, I know that my space within that relationship is not to rock their boat, but to rock the boat of the institution. So that would be one of the first things is being very clear on who my sort of target is or what my target is, and then being also very clear on how I'm aligning myself with my main contacts. If I'm in a situation where, let's say that it's a cis white man who has been in leadership for a very long time, is my main contact, who has a board potentially, who's saying, this work is really difficult and I don't like feeling uncomfortable, then I know that that's not going to be a coddling situation. Because I know that person in particular, as in terms of the ways in which they are treated by society, in terms of the ways in which they are not really put in positions to hold accountability for their actions. I'm not going to really coddle that person, but I am going to be asking them, okay, who actually are your direct reports? Where are those people of color? Because those are probably the folks that I need to be talking to in terms of where are your pain points? How are you experiencing difficulty? So for me, I think it really is a gut sort of response that is trauma informed, and that also definitely is deeply rooted in analyzing systems of power. And that's institutionally, but I think even more importantly in that case, it's interpersonally. What is this person actually experiencing on a day-to-day basis in life? And then also, what is this person actually experiencing on a day-to-day basis within the organization?
Good afternoon. We've talked about DEI work centered within diversity, equity, inclusion of organizations that may be white dominant. Can you all speak about the type of racial work and racial healing work that we must do as people of color with one another, Black and brown in particular, to be able to advance and dream beyond that hierarchy that we heard about this morning?
So I'll start with a quick anecdote. The I remember the day when two colleagues walked into my office. Two colleagues who were African American walked into my office and said, "Jessica, we need you to remove your application for this job. It's not your turn. Your people just showed up, and while we love what you do, you need to remove your application. You're brown, you're immigrant, and you're queer, and we are not ready for that." And they were two elders, and so I was like, I mean, I said many cussing things, but after I was done with that, I went and removed my application. And I think that I learned a lesson that day, which is that the work of race equity, socially